Okay, let's talk workflow organization and productivity. Well, we are going to start with the topic of distraction because we know that distraction is very costly for organizations and for individuals. It just consider these statistics. It decreases productivity by up to 40%. It doubles error rates. It puts us at greater risk of injuries and accidents in the workplace, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. It increases our stress levels. It increases cortisol, right? That is the stress chemical in the body. It decreases our creative output. Now, how does it do that? Well, if we don't create digital boundaries, then we cannot create a state of deep work or flow. And when we are creative, we need our mind to be free, and we need to be free from distractions and things. The mind almost has to be bored in order to be creative. And so distraction is really a creativity killer. And I chose this picture because these were the types of offices that over the past decade became really popular. They thought open offices that were structured like this is more conducive for brainstorming and for, you know, brainstorming and creativity and all of that good stuff. But they have found that actually what has happened is that it has reduced productivity and it has reduced creativity because of the amount of distractions. So now they are going back to creating offices with cubicles, etc. So I mentioned that distraction is costly, and at the risk of sounding like a public service announcement, let's talk for a second about distracted driving. There are three different types of distraction. There is visual, manual, and cognitive. So visual, in the example of distracted driving, visual means that our eyes would be off the road. Manual would be that our hands are off the wheel. And cognitive would mean that our mind is not on driving, it is on something else. And driving while digitally distracted is extremely dangerous because it applies all three of those: visual, manual, and cognitive. And so we need to develop habits to resist distraction. And texting makes a crash up to 23 times more likely to happen. And mental distractions can last up to 27 seconds after the text is done or a distraction happens. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Actually, sorry, that's a typo. It should be 23. But distraction is a factor in almost 14% of all crashes. And drivers under the age of 20 have the highest proportion of fatal crashes related to distraction. And that is simply because 50% of teens will admit to reading a text message or getting an email while driving. And that was a study that asked teens that how often did that happen in the past 30 days. And they found that for half of all teenagers, they have read a message or an email in that time. And I would argue that that number is probably a lot higher because not all teens are going to admit to doing that behavior. So we know that nearly 9 people are killed every day in the US due to distracted driving. So again, I'm sorry if that sounded like a public service announcement, but the bottom line is that it can be very dangerous. And so we need to be able to fix. So how do we fix people's behavior? Well, we can do this through dialogue, right? By talking about it like we are right now, through education, as well as behavior modification. So let's talk about distraction. And really, when we are texting and driving, what we are doing is multitasking. And multitasking is a myth. We love to glorify being busy. But there is a big difference between being busy and being productive. And doing one thing at a time is infinitely more productive than multitasking. And scientifically, the more accurate term is continuous partial attention or task switching. And this happens every time we stop what we are doing to answer an email when it comes in or a text message notification when it appears. Studies also show that task switching increases our error rates, as I mentioned before, on subsequent tasks. And this is due to something called attention residue. And attention residue refers to the inability of the brain to transition fully from one task to another. So what happens essentially is that when we move from task A to task B, say we're working on a project or we're studying, and then we hear a notification go off on our phone, when we switch our attention to our phone, part of our brain is actually still left on task A. Okay, it's still thinking about whatever material we were just reading, that kind of thing. And our brain, it doesn't work like a light switch, right? Even though we would like it to. And according to Cal Newport, who is an author of a book called Deep Work, studies show that it actually takes people on average up to 23 minutes to fully return to deep work mode or fully return to that task that we were originally doing, which was perhaps studying or reading or whatever it was. So therefore, multitasking is incompatible with getting into a state of deep work or flow, a state of attention, a state of focus and concentration. And deep work, let's talk about what that is right now. Deep work is a term that was, as I mentioned, coined by Cal Newport. And he said that deep work is when we engage in a high intensity, highly focused, distraction-free work that is needed in order to do cognitively demanding tasks. So these are things like, studying, writing academic papers, etc. And so what we need to do is to figure out when we're most productive and keep that time open and schedule it for deep work. And this may not be something we need to schedule every day. It's going to depend on your workload, but most of us, many of us, probably engage in what he calls shallow work. And shallow work does not require as much from us cognitively as deep work does. Deep work is highly productive and allows people to get more work done in a short period of time because of its intensity and its focus. So there will be times when deep work mode is needed and we have to learn to distance ourselves from things that distract us, like social media or our roommates or our kids or our barking dogs. Now, sometimes in order to get into that mode, right, we have to create boundaries. And one of the things that I want you to think about, because some people will say, well, I'm just going to turn off my notifications and I'll just leave my phone here. But what we know is that the mere presence of a phone is enough to distract us from the task at hand. And I want you to consider this data that was collected from thousands of high school students and this is research from the Character Lab Research Network. And what they found was they studied students who were studying. They studied students who were studying, and they reported where they kept their phones. So a group of students had their phone on their desk with the screen up and the sound on. And then the next group of students had their phone next to them, but the screen was down and notifications were off. And then another group of students had their phone in the same room as them, but out of sight. And then the next group had it in their room, out of sight and out of reach. And then another group had their phone in another room altogether. And the results were that the higher the report card grade result was, the further the phone was away from them when they were studying. So what that means is that even though your phone may be turned off and may be silenced, if it is near you when you are trying to get into a state of deep work or flow, which is required when you are studying or, trying to do great work, it is incompatible because the mere presence of that phone is enough to distract your brain. And we can see that there was a clear association that the further away the phone was, the better that the students did on their test scores. So manipulating our surroundings has actually proven to be a very, very highly effective form of self-control. So I'm not asking you to swear your phones off altogether, but it is possible to outsmart your smartphone. So I want to talk to you a little bit about time management. This is an exercise that I do in some of my training sessions, and it's a theory called Big Rock Theory. It's by Dr. Stephen Covey. And I want you to think about this. Your big rocks are your priorities, and they are, oh, I skipped that, sorry. So I wanted to mention that Stephen Covey wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It was really popular, I think back in the early 90s when it was first out. But anyways, I don't remember any of those 7 habits, but I do remember his theory on time management, which he called Big Rock Theory. And the idea here was that, if we don't prioritize putting our big tasks and projects or goals or things that we absolutely need to accomplish first, then we're not going to be able to fill in the little things. And so when he was talking with his audience about his theory on time, he used this jar, this clear glass jar, very similar to the one you see on your screen. And he put in all of the large rocks first, and he asked his audience, is the jar full? And a couple of people said yes. And he says, well, no, they're not, because, I'm going to put in some smaller rocks. And so then he would fill up some smaller rocks, and that would fill in some space. And then he would ask again, is it full? And they said, well, no, because now they're onto him. And he filled it up with some sand and gravel. And when he was done with that, he put some water in. And so at that point, it is overflowing and now is completely full. And he used this to say to them that, yes, if we don't put in our big rocks first, then we are not going to be able to fit them in later, right? And our big rocks are our tasks or our projects. And the sand and the water is just things like endless scrolling behaviors and spending time maybe online where we don't really need to. So we really have to make sure that we set intentions with our time and that we prioritize those big tasks or projects, and don't let them seep in too soon. Make sure that we schedule those things that are important. So that sets the stage for creating digital boundaries, and I am going to actually do this in a new video.